I don't know. I've always thought, Gus, that I've never been troubled by ego. Maybe I'm troubled much more than I think. Maybe egos come in different shapes, sizes, and colors, and everything else. I look at what I have to do, and the older I get, the more I realize I can't do it without God's help.
At 90, Jimmy Swaggart is finally coming clean about the dark truth behind his empire. From secret hotel rooms to million-dollar scandals, the man who once made $500,000 a day is revealing what really happened. A bitter enemy's revenge plot, hidden cameras in Room 7, and the shocking confession that destroyed everything. This is the story America's most powerful televangelist tried to bury. Jimmy Swaggart was born on March 15, 1935, in Faraday, Louisiana. It was a small town with no paved roads and no electricity. His father, Willie Leon "Son" Swaggart, was a Pentecostal preacher and a fiddle player. His mother, Minnie Belle Heron, came from a family of sharecroppers. Faith was the center of their lives. They were part of the Assemblies of God, a church that believed in spiritual gifts, like speaking in tongues. This devotion shaped Jimmy from an early age. Church was more than a Sunday tradition. It was where people found hope. It was loud, emotional, and filled with music. Jimmy's mother sang in the choir. His father played the fiddle during worship. Music was in his blood, but so was rebellion. As a teenager, he gambled and played pool, but he refused to use his musical talent outside of church. He believed it was meant only for God. At just 8 years old, he said he felt a calling to preach. That calling never left him. But his early years as a preacher were filled with hardship. In the 1950s, he made just $30 per week, barely enough to support his wife and son. They had no home of their own, often staying in church basements or with other pastors. Through all of this, one person never left his side: Frances Anderson. Jimmy married her on October 10, 1952, when he was 17, and she was just 15. Her parents didn't approve. They wanted her to finish school and build a better future. But Jimmy was determined. To make it happen, he reportedly lied about Frances's age on the marriage license. Their life together started with nothing. After the wedding, they moved in with Jimmy's parents because they had no money. Frances's mother was heartbroken, believing her daughter had given up too much. But Frances believed in Jimmy's mission. She stood by him through every struggle. Jimmy Swaggart started his ministry in the 1950s with almost nothing. He traveled across rural Louisiana with his wife Frances and their young son, Donnie, preaching wherever he could. He made just $30 a week, which is about $290 today. That wasn't enough to provide for his family, so they lived wherever they could. Church basements, tiny motels, even in the homes of pastors who offered them shelter. Every day was a struggle, but Swaggart refused to give up. He preached anywhere people would listen. Sometimes it was inside small country churches. Other times, it was on a flatbed trailer in an open field. Many of the congregations he spoke to could barely afford to give him anything, but he kept going. Frances stood by his side, helping him manage their home while supporting his ministry. Donnie grew up watching his parents sacrifice everything for their faith. Life was hard, but something about Swaggart's preaching connected with people. His passion, his energy, his unwavering belief. These things drew listeners in. Slowly, his following started to grow. In 1960, he began recording gospel music and broadcasting his sermons on Christian radio. He still lived in poverty, but his voice was reaching more people. Those difficult years shaped the preacher he would become. They gave him a deep understanding of struggle, something his audiences could relate to. Around that same time, he was offered a way out. Sam Phillips, the legendary producer at Sun Records, wanted to sign him as the label's first gospel artist. Phillips had already made stars out of Elvis Presley and Swaggart's cousin, Jerry Lee Lewis, who was earning $20,000 a week. Compared to Swaggart's $30 a week, it was life-changing money. Phillips believed Swaggart could bring gospel music to a mainstream audience. He saw his talent and knew there was a market for it. But Swaggart said no. He believed his true calling was preaching, and signing a record deal would pull him away from that mission. Walking away meant more years of financial struggle, but he never looked back. Instead, he recorded gospel albums on his own and sold millions of copies through mail orders. He found a way to use music in his ministry without compromising what he believed in. In 1969, he took another leap of faith and launched the Camp Meeting Hour, a radio program that would change everything. At first, it was a small operation, funded mostly by his own sacrifices and a few donations. He delivered fiery sermons and played gospel music, hoping to reach as many people as possible. But after just a few broadcasts, he ran out of money. Airtime was expensive, and he didn't have enough to keep the show going. In desperation, he made an appeal on air, asking for help. Within days, 900 letters arrived, containing $3,000. That was enough to keep the program alive. From that moment, the Camp Meeting Hour began to grow. By the 1970s, it was on more than 650 stations across the country. His voice was no longer limited to Louisiana. It was reaching the entire nation. Jimmy Swaggart stepped into television ministry in 1975, and from that moment, everything changed. His weekly program started on local stations, but it didn't stay small for long. Viewers connected with his passionate preaching and gospel music, and within a few years, his reach exploded. By the early 1980s, Swaggart's broadcasts aired in over 143 countries and were translated into multiple languages. No televangelist before him had ever reached that many people. By 1983, Swaggart's telecasts were on more than 250 television stations across the United States. His daily Bible study programs became a routine for millions of viewers. At its peak, his U.S. audience reached 2.1 million households every week, making him one of the most watched religious figures of his time. His ability to blend fiery sermons with soulful music kept audiences engaged, turning his program into a must-watch event. His rapid rise came at the perfect time. Advancements in broadcasting technology helped Swaggart expand even further. By the mid-1980s, his programs weren't just airing in the United States. They were reaching people in Africa, Asia, and South America. His influence stretched far beyond religion. During the 1980s, he became a key figure in the Christian right movement, even gaining access to President Ronald Reagan. But with success on such a massive scale came challenges. As the years went on, controversy would threaten to undo everything he had built. At the height of his ministry, the financial numbers were staggering. By 1987, Jimmy Swaggart Ministries was pulling in $150 million a year. That's more than $500,000 every working day. This enormous revenue came from viewer donations and sales of gospel records, books, and other merchandise. His organization even ran one of the largest mail-order businesses in Louisiana. Swaggart's headquarters in Baton Rouge reflected the wealth pouring in. His ministry operated from a massive campus that included the Family Worship Center, a 7,000-seat megachurch, along with a Bible college and cutting-edge production facilities. One of the most expensive additions was the Zoe Vance Teleproduction Center, built with a $7 million inheritance from a wealthy donor. These high-end studios allowed Swaggart to produce television programs at a level few others in religious broadcasting could match. The money also funded a luxurious lifestyle. Swaggart and his family lived in a $1.5 million mansion on a 20-acre estate with a swimming pool and gold-plated fixtures. He flew in a private Gulfstream jet and drove matching luxury cars with his wife. Despite running a non-profit ministry, Swaggart kept financial details hidden by classifying his organization as a church, which meant it was exempt from public financial disclosures. Critics questioned the secrecy, but it didn't stop millions of followers from giving. That loyalty would be tested, though, when scandals brought the ministry into crisis. One of the clearest signs of Swaggart's incredible influence was the sheer amount of mail his ministry received. At its peak, over 1 million letters arrived every month, so many that the ministry had its own postal zip code. These letters weren't just fan mail. They included prayer requests, personal stories, and, most importantly, donations. The ministry needed a huge workforce to handle the constant flood of mail. Swaggart's headquarters employed thousands of staff members, making it one of Baton Rouge's largest employers. The letters also served as a powerful fundraising tool. They helped the ministry track audience engagement and fine-tune donation campaigns, ensuring the money kept flowing in. Swaggart's reach went far beyond television. He sold millions of gospel albums and videotapes, spreading his message through music and home recordings. His monthly magazine, The Evangelist, kept followers engaged even when they weren't watching his broadcasts. Every platform he used helped expand his influence, making him one of the most powerful figures in televangelism. Jimmy Swaggart wasn't just a preacher, he was a force of nature. His sermons weren't quiet reflections. They were firestorms filled with passion, urgency, and warnings of judgment. In the 1980s, he reached over 2.1 million viewers every week in the U.S., making him one of the most influential televangelists of his time. His preaching wasn't about gentle persuasion, it was about shaking people awake. He painted vivid pictures of heaven and hell, calling his audience to repentance with the kind of intensity that made them shout, cry, or drop to their knees in prayer. For Swaggart, the battle wasn't just spiritual. He saw America slipping away from its Christian roots and took it upon himself to call out the forces he believed were responsible. He preached against secularism, liberalism, and what he saw as the moral decay of society. He spoke against abortion, homosexuality, pornography, and feminism, warning that they were tearing apart the foundation of the family. He didn't stop there. He also attacked modern psychology, calling it one of Satan's greatest tools. He believed self-help and therapy had replaced faith in many churches, leading people away from God instead of bringing them closer. But not everyone saw it the same way. Critics accused him of relying too much on emotion and not enough on deep theological teaching. They argued that stirring people's feelings was easy, but true faith needed more than fiery sermons. Then came the scandals. Jimmy Swaggart's 1988 scandal was one of the most dramatic moments in televangelism history. At the time, he was one of the most powerful preachers in America. His sermons reached millions through television, and his ministry brought in around $140 million a year. But behind the scenes, a bitter feud was about to bring everything crashing down. In 1986, Swaggart accused fellow assemblies of God minister Marvin Gorman of having extramarital affairs. The accusations destroyed Gorman's reputation, cost him his ministerial credentials, and shut down his ministry. Gorman was humiliated, but he didn't just accept defeat. He wanted revenge, and he spent the next 2 years planning it. By 1988, Gorman and his family had gathered enough information to set a trap. They knew Swaggart was visiting prostitutes, so they decided to catch him in the act. With a camera hidden behind a black cloth, Gorman's son Randy and son-in-law Garland Bilbo staked out the Travel Inn Motel on Airline Highway in New Orleans. It was a known hotspot for prostitution. On February 16th, they got exactly what they were looking for. Swaggart was caught on camera entering room 7 with Deborah Murphy, a local prostitute. The images were undeniable. At first, Gorman gave Swaggart a chance to make things right. He demanded an apology and a public retraction of the accusations that had ruined his life. But Swaggart refused. That was a mistake. Gorman took the evidence straight to the Assemblies of God leadership, and within days, church officials confronted Swaggart. The scandal broke soon after, sending shockwaves through his ministry. 5 days later, on February 21st, 1988, Swaggart stood before his congregation and delivered an emotional confession. Tears streamed down his face as he admitted to moral failures, but he avoided giving any specific details. The broadcast reached millions, making it one of the most infamous moments in televangelism history. But no amount of tears could undo the damage. The Assemblies of God responded quickly. Church leaders ordered Swaggart to step down from preaching for 1 year and undergo 2 years of counseling. The goal was to restore trust and give him a path to redemption. But Swaggart refused, saying that being out of the public eye for that long would destroy his ministry, his television empire, and his Bible college. For him, stepping away wasn't an option. On April 8, 1988, the Assemblies of God Executive Presbytery held an emergency meeting. Over an 80-minute telephone call, they made their decision. Swaggart was to be defrocked. He would lose his ministerial credentials and be permanently cut off from the denomination. But before the church could announce its decision, Swaggart got ahead of them. He resigned from the Assemblies of God on his own terms. Just weeks later, on May 22, 1988, Swaggart returned to the pulpit as an independent preacher. His decision outraged religious leaders and the public alike. He had once demanded strict punishment for other fallen ministers, but now, when faced with his own scandal, he refused to accept discipline. The hypocrisy was clear. But that wasn't the only incident. On October 11, 1991, Jimmy Swaggart was driving a 1989 Jaguar through Indio, California, when police pulled him over for driving on the wrong side of the road. His car had expired out-of-state plates, and he wasn't wearing a seatbelt. Officers cited him for multiple traffic violations, but that was just the beginning. Sitting beside him in the car was Rosemary Garcia, a known prostitute. Garcia later spoke to reporters and made it clear what had happened. "He asked me for sex," she said. "I mean, that's why he stopped me. That's what I do. I'm a prostitute." According to her, Swaggart panicked when he saw a police car behind him and quickly tried to hide pornographic magazines before the officers approached. The entire situation was all too familiar. Just 3 years earlier, in 1988, Swaggart had been caught in a scandal involving another prostitute at a motel in New Orleans. That time, he had stood before his congregation with tears in his eyes and begged for forgiveness. This time, he had a different approach. Instead of a tearful confession, Swaggart stood in front of his congregation at the Family Worship Center and made a bold statement. "The Lord told me it's flat, none of your business." His son Donnie later announced that Swaggart would be stepping down for a time of healing and counseling, but the damage was already done. Before his first scandal in 1988, Swaggart was one of the most powerful televangelists in the world. His sermons reached 510 million viewers across 145 countries. His ministry brought in $150 million a year, and donations averaged $500,000 every single day. But after the first scandal, his empire started to crumble. When the second scandal broke in 1991, everything fell apart. Major television networks dropped his programs. His international broadcasts, once a key part of his ministry, were shut down. The ministry had to sell off production equipment just to keep going. Donations plummeted. The Jimmy Swaggart Bible College, which had over 1,000 students at its peak, saw enrollment drop to just 370 in the early 1990s. Many of his followers, who had forgiven him once, refused to do it again. His refusal to apologize only pushed more people away. Meanwhile, his financial situation got worse. In the 1980s, Jimmy Swaggart was one of the biggest televangelists in the world. His ministry brought in around $150 million a year, mostly from donations and sales of gospel records, books, and merchandise. His television broadcasts reached millions, and his empire included a massive 257-acre campus with a Bible college and a state-of-the-art production center. But in 1988, everything started to fall apart. That year, Swaggart was caught in a prostitution scandal. The impact was immediate. Donations dropped, TV networks canceled his program, and attendance at his family worship center in Baton Rouge collapsed. His ministry, which once employed 1,500 staff members and needed $350,000 every day to operate, was forced to lay off workers and shut down projects. By 1991, his television audience had fallen to just 400,000 households, down from millions. His Bible college lost most of its students and faculty. The empire that once stood as a symbol of his success was now struggling to survive. In desperation, Swaggart even began pleading for small donations during his sermons. The financial troubles raised bigger questions. Swaggart's ministry was classified as a church, which meant it didn't have to disclose financial records to the IRS. Critics argued that much of the money was spent on television production, private jets, and aggressive fundraising rather than actual charity. By the mid-1990s, his annual income had dropped to just $11 million, a shadow of what it had been at his peak. His empire, once unstoppable, was now in ruins. Swaggart's downfall wasn't just about money. His legal troubles were just as devastating. Back in 1986, he had accused fellow televangelist Marvin Gorman of adultery and helped remove him from the Assemblies of God Church. The scandal ruined Gorman's ministry and pushed him into bankruptcy. Seeking revenge, Gorman fought back. In 1987, he sued Swaggart for defamation, arguing that the accusations had been exaggerated or even false. The trial was explosive. Gorman's legal team presented evidence suggesting Swaggart had used the scandal to eliminate competition. But the biggest twist came when Gorman revealed that he had hired a private investigator who later exposed Swaggart's involvement with prostitutes. That revelation helped bring down Swaggart's career. In 1991, the jury ruled against Swaggart. He was found guilty of defamation and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The court awarded Gorman $10 million in damages, $1 million for personal damages, and $9 million for his ministry. After appeals, the case was settled in 1994 for $1.85 million, a massive financial hit for a ministry already struggling to stay afloat. Jimmy Swaggart's life has been shaped by faith, family, and controversy. His journey began in Faraday, Louisiana, where he was born on March 15, 1935. Growing up in a small town, he was surrounded by music and religion. His cousin, Jerry Lee Lewis, would go on to become a rock and roll legend, while another cousin, Mickey Gilley, found fame in country music. But Jimmy chose a different path. Preaching called to him from a young age, and despite the hardships that followed, He never let go of that calling. In 1952, at just 17 years old, he married Frances Anderson, who was only 15 at the time. Their early years were filled with struggle. Money was scarce, and they often relied on the kindness of churches to provide shelter. In the 1950s, they lived on just $30 a week, which in today's money would be around $330. They stayed in church basements or in the homes of pastors, while Jimmy traveled to preach wherever he could. Life was hard, but Frances never wavered. She wasn't just a wife, she was a partner in his ministry. Over the decades, Frances became a driving force behind Jimmy Swaggart Ministries. Today, she serves as the chief financial officer of the organization, overseeing 255 employees. Her leadership has been instrumental in the ministry's survival and growth. Jimmy himself has praised her abilities, once saying she could run a corporation as large as General Motors. But finances weren't her only contribution. She became a well-known voice in Christian broadcasting, hosting Frances and Friends, a daily talk show on the Sun Life Broadcasting Network. On the show, she discusses social issues, politics, and biblical teachings, often addressing controversial topics that affect the modern church. She has also written books, including The Modern Babylon in 2006 and Sarah Saw in 2016, solidifying her influence beyond just financial management. Their son, Donnie Swaggart, has followed closely in his father's footsteps. As executive vice president of Jimmy Swaggart Ministries, he plays a key role in running the organization while also preaching. He serves as co-pastor of the Family Worship Center in Baton Rouge, Louisiana, where he delivers passionate sermons that focus heavily on Pentecostal beliefs and the role of the Holy Spirit. His style is intense and energetic, reminiscent of his father's early preaching. Like Jimmy, Donnie has taken his message beyond the church walls, traveling across the United States and internationally for evangelistic events. He is also a main speaker at the ministry's biannual camp meetings, gatherings that draw thousands of believers looking for spiritual renewal. The Swaggart legacy doesn't stop with Donnie. His son, Gabriel, has taken on a leadership role as well, heading Crossfire Youth Ministry, an outreach program designed for young Christians. Another son, Matthew, contributes in a different way, working as a television graphics artist and photographer for the ministry. This deep family involvement shows just how much the Swaggarts have built their lives around faith and evangelism. Despite their dedication to ministry, the Swaggarts have not been without controversy. Jimmy Swaggart's leadership style has been described as both powerful and controlling. While he built one of the largest televangelist empires of the 20th century, former employees have accused him of being authoritarian. Some claim he demanded complete loyalty and kept a tight grip on financial and operational decisions within the ministry. The biggest blow to his reputation came in 1988. By then, Swaggart was one of the most influential televangelists in America, with a global audience watching his fiery sermons on television. But in February of that year, everything changed. He was caught in a prostitution scandal, a revelation that led to his suspension and eventual defrocking by the Assemblies of God. The scandal was a shocking moment for the Christian world, not only because of what he had done, but because of what he had preached. Just 2 years earlier, Swaggart had helped expose fellow televangelist Jim Bakker's sexual misconduct. He had publicly condemned Bakker's actions, presenting himself as a defender of morality. When his own sins were exposed, the hypocrisy was undeniable. The fallout was immediate. The Assemblies of God stripped him of his ministerial credentials, and many of his supporters turned away. His television empire, which had once brought in millions of dollars in donations, began to crumble. But Swaggart refused to step away from preaching. In 1991, he was caught in another prostitution scandal, further damaging his already fragile reputation. Yet despite these public humiliations, he never fully disappeared from the religious scene. To maintain control over his ministry, Swaggart made a strategic decision. Rather than remain under the authority of a larger church body, he transitioned his ministry into an independent, non-denominational organization. This move gave him full control, allowing him to continue preaching without outside oversight. Critics argue that this only strengthened his authoritarian tendencies, but for Swaggart, it was a way to keep his vision alive. Financial questions have followed him throughout his career. At its height, Jimmy Swaggart Ministries had an $11.5 million payroll, and questions arose about how funds were being managed. Allegations of excessive spending clashed with the humble image he projected. Some accused him of using donations for personal luxury rather than ministry efforts. Despite these controversies, he has managed to keep the organization running, largely through the reach of Sun Life Broadcasting Network, which continues to attract viewers around the world. Even now, Jimmy Swaggart remains a divisive figure. To his critics, he represents the dangers of unchecked religious power, a man who preached righteousness but failed to live by his own teachings. To his supporters, he is a symbol of resilience, a preacher who fell but refused to stay down. No matter which side people fall on, one thing is certain: his influence on modern televangelism is impossible to ignore.